She found him in a slick of motor oil and darker blood, hovering over two toddlers on the wet asphalt like they were the only things tethering him to earth. He was dying, and he was aiming a gun straight at her chest. The freezing mist had been clinging to the service alley behind the Grand Meridian Hotel for 6 hours straight. The kind of city damp that turned cobblestones into hazards and chilled straight through cheap polyester-made uniforms. Monique Harris wiped the rain from her eyes, her breath fogging the air as she hauled the heavy trash bag toward the dumpster. The service entrance clock glowed 3:14. She'd been on her feet since 5 that afternoon, scrubbing luxury suites until 10, then straight into the graveyard shift laundry rotation. She spent her 20s dreaming of running her own daycare before the debt collectors came calling. In the end, survival made her invisible to everyone, until tonight. The heavy black bag landed in the dumpster with a wet thud, the sound swallowed by the relentless drumming of the rain. Monique wiped her hands on her apron, shivering as the damp cold seeped through the thin soles of her work shoes. She was a ghost in this city. Guests looked right through her in the hallways. The manager only saw a pair of hands to scrub toilets. In the grand scheme of the Grand Meridian Hotel, she didn't exist. Just as she reached for the handle of the service door, a screech of tires shattered the hum of the rain, followed by the sickening crunch of metal on brick. Monique froze, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Deep in the alley shadows, a sleek black sedan sat crushed against the far wall of the loading dock. Steam hissed violently from the radiator, mingling with the fog. A man stumbled out of the driver's side, clutching his ribs. He was dressed in a suit that cost more than her life's earnings, but right now, it was ruined by the slick, dark stains spreading across his white shirt. Monique knew the smart thing to do, the survival thing. She should fade back into the hotel, lock the door, and pretend she saw nothing. But then the rear door of the sedan swung open, and she saw them. 2 toddlers, no older than 2, sat on the wet pavement where they had been pulled from the wreckage. They weren't crying yet. They were too stunned, clinging to each other in the freezing drizzle, their eyes wide and dark. "Down!" the man roared, his voice wet and ragged. High beams swept the alley entrance. An engine revved. Monique didn't think about the debt collectors, her aching back, or the safety of the hotel door. She didn't think at all. She sprinted across the slick concrete, sliding on her knees into the oily mud. She curled her body around the small children, pressing their faces into the crook of her shoulder just as the air cracked with the sound of suppressed gunfire. Concrete chips sprayed her hair. She squeezed her eyes shut, her arms locking like iron bands around the twins, waiting for the burn of a bullet. But the firing stopped as abruptly as it began. A return shot, loud, thunderous, unsuppressed, echoed from the man near the car. Silence followed, heavy and terrified, broken only by the twins starting to whimper against her chest. Monique looked up, gasping for air. The man, Kwon, was leaning against the crumpled fender, a smoking hand cannon in his grip, his face a mask of pale, sweating fury. He wasn't looking at the alley entrance. The threat was momentarily suppressed. He was looking at her, or rather at the human shield covering his heirs. He stumbled toward her, swaying dangerously. The muzzle of his weapon drifted until it leveled straight at her chest. "My car is dead," he rasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. He gestured vaguely toward the street with the gun, his eyes glazing over with pain but his grip distinct and lethal. "You have a car." A station wagon," Monique stammered, feeling the rapid, bird-like heartbeat of the child pressed against her heart. "Parked around the corner." "Get them up," he commanded, collapsing to one knee but keeping the aim steady. "Drive, or we all die right here." The heater in Monique's rusted station wagon rattled like a dying lung, blowing lukewarm air that did nothing to cut the bone-deep chill. Next to her, Kwon was fatting. The scent of copper and expensive cologne filled the small cabin, overpowering the smell of stale pine air freshener. He held a wad of napkins from her glove box against his side, his breathing shallow and wet. "We're passing Mercy General," Monique said, her grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. "I'm turning in." "No," Kwon wheezed. The gun, resting heavily in his lap, shifted slightly toward her. "No hospitals, no police, drive home." "You'll die if I don't," she snapped, surprised by the sharpness in her own voice. And then what happens to them? She glanced in the rearview mirror. The twins were huddled together in the backseat, strapped into the mismatched car seats she kept for her sister's kids. They had stopped crying, settling into a terrifying, silent shock. Their lips were turning a faint shade of blue, their wet clothes clinging to their small frames. "Just drive," Kwon commanded, though his eyes were slipping shut. Monique cursed under her breath and swung the wheel hard, bypassing the hospital turnoff. She navigated the labyrinth of potholes that marked the boundary of her neighborhood, the stacks. Here, the streetlights were mostly burnt out, and the shadows held their own kind of predators. She pulled into the dark lot behind her peeling apartment complex, killing the engine. The silence that followed was heavy. "I can't take you up there," Monique whispered, panic finally clawing at her throat. "I'm nobody. If I bring you into my house, I bring your war with you." Kwon turned his head, his gaze glassy but unyielding. "You have no choice." She wanted to run. She wanted to leave the car and scream for help until the police came. But then she heard a chattering sound from the back seat. One of the twins, Jaden maybe, was shivering so violently his teeth were clicking. The fear for her own life vanished, replaced instantly by a furious, protective heat. They were Bobby's. They were freezing, wet, and alone in a car with a dying gangster. Monique unbuckled her seatbelt and shoved her door open. "Can you walk?" she demanded, rounding the car to the back door. Kwon grunted, using the dashboard to leverage himself up. Monique threw open the rear door and unbuckled the boys. She hoisted one onto each hip, their damp weight solid and grounding. They buried their cold faces into her neck, seeking warmth. She looked at Kwon, who was swaying by the trunk, clutching his side. "Keep up," she warned, turning toward the graffiti-covered service entrance. "Because I'm not carrying you, too." The deadbolt clicked into place, sealing the world out, but the terror was already inside. Kwon slid down the wall of her tiny kitchenette, leaving a smear of red against the peeling yellow wallpaper. He landed hard, the gun clattering onto the linoleum within arm's reach. Monique didn't go to him first. She went to the sofa where she had deposited the twins. They were hysterical now, the shock wearing off to reveal cold and confusion. Their wails filled the cramped apartment, bouncing off the thin walls. "Hush now, hush," she murmured, her hands moving with frantic efficiency. She stripped off their sodden clothes, tossing the expensive, muddy garments into a pile. She wrapped them in her thickest quilt, rubbing their small backs to generate heat. "I know, baby, I know it's cold." She left them huddled on the couch, a bundle of shivering misery, and turned to the man bleeding out on her floor. Kwon's eyes were unfocused, his skin the color of ash. Monique grabbed the plastic first aid kit from under the sink, mostly Band-Aids and expired gauze, and a half-empty bottle of cheap vodka from the freezer. "Don't you die on me," she muttered, kneeling beside him. "I am not explaining a dead body to my landlord." She took her kitchen shears and cut through the ruined silk of his shirt. The wound was ugly, a jagged tear just below his ribs. It was pulsing sluggishly. "This is going to burn," she warned. Kwon didn't answer. He was staring at the ceiling, his breathing ragged. Monique unscrewed the vodka and poured it directly into the wound. Kwon's back arched off the floor, a guttural sound tearing from his throat that was half groan, half scream. The twins shrieked in response, their crying reaching a fever pitch. The sound grated against Monique's frayed nerves, but she forced herself to breathe. She grabbed a towel, pressing it hard against the wound to staunch the flow. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word." Her voice trembled on the first note, then steadied. She sang the lullaby loud enough to cut through the chaos, a desperate counter-melody to the violence in her kitchen. She pressed down harder on the bullet wound, feeling the warm, sticky blood coating her fingers. "Mama's gonna buy you a mockingbird." Kwon's thrashing slowed. His head lolled to the side, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. His hand, which had been clawing weakly at his holster, fell limp against the linoleum. "And if that mockingbird don't sing?" Monique checked his pulse. It was thready, weak, but there. He had passed out from the pain or the blood loss or both. She looked from the unconscious killer to the two weeping children watching her with wide, wet eyes. Her hands were stained scarlet, but her voice kept the rhythm, soft and steady, the only thing holding the night together. Kwon didn't wake up like a normal man. He woke up like a trapped animal. One moment he was unconscious, the next his eyes snapped open, dark and focused, his hand lashing out to grab the nearest threat. He caught Monique's wrist in a grip that felt like steel wire. Monique hissed, dropping the wet rag she had been using to scrub the blood from her linoleum. "Let go," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. Kwon didn't release her. He scanned the room wildly, the peeling wallpaper, the bubbling radiator, the sleeping twins huddled under a quilt on the sofa, before his gaze locked back onto her. "Where is my gun?" "On top of the fridge," Monique said, wrenching her arm free. She rubbed the red marks he left behind. "Where the kids can't reach it, you're welcome." Kwon tried to sit up, but a groan tore through his gritted teeth. He looked down at his chest, seeing the neat rows of butterfly stitches and the heavy tapping over the wound. He touched the dressing tentatively, then glared at her. "You're not a doctor." "I was almost a nurse," she corrected, dipping the rag back into the bucket of bleach water. "And right now, I'm the only reason you aren't bleeding out in a police precinct or a morgue." Kwon ignored her. He grabbed the edge of the kitchen table and hauled himself up. His face went gray, sweat instantly beading on his forehead. "I have to leave if they track me here." "If you walk out that door, you won't make it to the sidewalk," Monique said, not bothering to look up from her scrubbing. "I am not dying in this box," he spat, pushing himself away from the table. He took one step toward the door, swaying like a drunkard. He took a second step, and his knees buckled. He went down hard, crashing into a stack of old magazines. The noise made the twins stir on the couch, Jaden letting out a sleepy whimper. Monique was there in a second, but not to help him up. She stood over him, hands on her hips, blocking his path to the door. The fear she had felt in the alley was gone, replaced by the sheer, angry practicality of a woman who had cleaned up too many messes to tolerate another one. "Look at you," she said, her voice low and hard. "You think you're scary, you're a ghost, you leave, you tear those stitches. You tear those stitches, you bleed out. And then what?" She pointed a trembling finger at the sleeping toddlers. "You die and those bobbies are orphans. Is that the plan?" Kwon looked up at her from the floor. The ferocity in his eyes wavered, replaced by a flicker of something else. Humiliation, perhaps, or recognition. He looked at the twins, then back at the maid standing over him like a sentinel. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Finally, Kwon let his head rest back against the wall, the fight draining out of him. "Water," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I need water." Monique let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She turned to the sink and filled a chipped mug. The balance of power had shifted. He might be the boss of the city, but in this apartment, he was just another broken thing she had to fix. The adrenaline of the night had faded, leaving behind a heavy, watchful silence. The twins sat on the frayed rug, pushing two battered toy cars Monique had dug out of a closet, relics from her nephew's last visit. Kwon watched them from the kitchen chair, his posture rigid despite the pain radiating from his stitched side. "Min-ho," Kwon said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "He was my right hand, my brother in everything but blood." He stared at the boys, who were blissfully unaware of the price on their heads. He didn't just want the seat. He wanted the line ended. Jaden and Jordan. They are the only thing that stands between him and total legitimacy. Monique set a bowl of steaming instant oatmeal on the table. "So they're targets just because they exist." "They are the legacy," Kwon corrected darkly. "In my world, blood is the only currency that matters." Monique looked at the toddlers. Jaden was trying to force a plastic truck into Jordan's hand, babbling in a mix of toddler Korean and English. They didn't look like currency. They looked like terrified little boys who needed a nap. "Well, in my world, blood just means you bleed like everyone else," Monique said, grabbing a wet wipe. She knelt beside the boys. "And if anyone asks, they aren't legacy. They aren't heirs. They're my nephews, the Harris boys." Kwon stiffened, his pride flaring even through the exhaustion. They are Kwon's. Not in this zip code, Monique countered, gently wiping oatmeal off Jordan's chin. The boy flinched at first, then leaned into her touch, his small hand gripping her wrist for stability. Here, being a Kwon gets them killed. Being a Harris gets them ignored. And right now, ignored is how we stay alive. She smiled at Jordan, a soft, genuine expression that transformed her tired, guarded face into something luminous. Right, baby. You're just Jaden Harris for a little while, just visiting your Auntie Mo. Jaden giggled, a bright, bubbling sound that seemed alien in the dingy apartment. Monique laughed with him, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. Kwon watched them from the shadows of the kitchen. He was used to women who looked at him with fear or calculation. He was used to nannies who treated his sons like porcelain dolls to be dusted and displayed. But he had never seen this easy, fierce warmth. Monique didn't treat them like princes or targets. She treated them like they were hers. He felt a strange tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the bullet wound. For the first time since the ambush, his hand drifted away from the gun on the table. He watched Monique tickle Jordan's stomach, drawing out a squeal of delight, and for a terrifying second, the boss of the Jumryong syndicate wished this lie could be the truth. A sharp, rhythmic pounding on the front door shattered the fragile peace of the apartment. Kwon was moving before the second knock landed. Despite his injuries, he was halfway to the refrigerator, his hand closing around the grip of his gun. His eyes were cold, dead things, the eyes of a man who had decided he would not be taken alive. "Stop," Monique hissed, intercepting him. She shoved his hand down, her voice a desperate whisper. "You shoot through that door and the police will be here in 3 minutes. Sit down. Hide the gun." "It could be them," Kwon growled. "It's Mrs. Higgins," Monique said, recognizing the specific, authoritative cadence of the knock. "She's the block captain. If I don't answer, she calls the super." She shoved Kwon toward the bedroom. "Stay out of sight. Keep the boys quiet." Kwon hesitated, then retreated into the shadows, pulling the twins with him. Monique took a breath, smoothed her hair, and unlocked the deadbolt. She pasted on a weary, apologetic smile, the mask she wore for hotel guests who complained about the thread count. Mrs. Higgins stood in the hallway, arms crossed over her floral housecoat, eyes narrowing behind thick glasses. "Monique, I heard crying, and I saw a man come in with you earlier, a man in a suit that costs more than this building." Monique leaned against the doorframe, blocking the view inside. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Higgins. It's my cousin, Dante. His wife kicked him out. Nasty divorce." She rolled her eyes, feigning exasperation. "He grabbed the kids and came here. The suit is all he has left, that's why she left him. Spent all their savings on clothes." Mrs. Higgins sniffed the air, suspicious. "He looked drunk, walking all wobbly." "Heartbroken," Monique corrected smoothly. "And maybe a little gin. I'm handling it. The boys are settling down now." The older woman's face softened just a fraction. "Well, tell him to keep it down. The walls are thin and folks are talking." "I will. Have a good night, Mrs. Higgins." Monique closed the door and leaned her forehead against the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She locked it, sliding the chain into place. That was close. Too close. 3 stories down, in the rain-slicked parking lot, the danger was far more precise than a nosy neighbor. A black SUV idled next to Monique's rusted station wagon, its engine a-low. Menacing purr. Inside, a man in a tactical vest stared at a tablet screen. A red dot pulsed steadily on the map, overlaid precisely on the apartment complex. "The transponder is active," the man said into his headset. "We found the car, and the watch signal is stationary. He's in the building." "Which floor?" a voice crackled in his ear. "The signal is bouncing off the steel structure. It's weak," the man replied, looking up at the towering brick facade of the projects. "But he's trapped. Seal the exits. We go door to door if we have to." The first kick didn't open the door, but it cracked the frame with a sound like a gunshot. Kwon was up instantly, the adrenaline overriding his failing body. He braced himself against the kitchen island, leveling his weapon at the splintering wood. He fired twice, thwack, thwack, the bullets punching through the door. A shout of pain echoed from the hallway, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. "Get back," Kwon roared, but his arm wavered. The recoil had torn something inside him. Fresh blood was already seeping through his shirt. He slumped, his vision blurring. He was a lion with no teeth left. Monique grabbed the twins, shoving them into the bathtub in the tiny bathroom. "Stay down! Do not move!" she commanded with a ferocity that made them freeze. She didn't reach for a knife. She reached under the sink. For years, she had sat through mandatory hotel safety seminars about the dangers of mixing cleaning agents. Never mix the blue bottle with the white jug. The manager would drone. It creates a deadly gas. Monique grabbed the gallon of industrial-strength bleach she had borrowed from the hotel's supply closet and a bottle of ammonia-heavy floor stripper. "Kwon, cover your face," she screamed, wrapping a wet towel around her own nose and mouth. The door gave way with a final, shattering crash. Two men in tactical gear surged into the entryway, rifles raised. Monique didn't throw a punch. She kicked the plastic mop bucket toward them and poured both bottles in simultaneously. The reaction was instant. A thick white vapor hissed up from the bucket, expanding violently into the confined space of the entryway. The lead assassin stepped right into the cloud. He gasped, inhaling a lungful of chloramine vapor, and immediately dropped his rifle, clawing at his throat as his airways spasmed and burned. "Gas!" the second man choked, stumbling back into the hallway, his eyes streaming tears. Monique slammed the bathroom door shut and shoved a damp towel into the crack at the bottom. She dragged Kwon in with her. "The vents," she hacked, her eyes stinging despite the towel. "The building has a central draft. If I open the bathroom vent, it pulls air in." She stood on the toilet and smashed the rusted vent cover with the heel of her shoe. Cold night air rushed in, pushing the creeping toxic fog back out under the door, forcing it into the hallway where the assassins were coughing and retching. Kwon looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and wide with disbelief. He was a man who understood ballistics and leverage, but he had just watched a maid disable a hit squad with a mop bucket. "Chemical warfare," he wheezed, a bloody grin tugging at his mouth. "Housekeeping," Monique corrected grimly, tightening her grip on the terrified twins. "Now we move." The chloramine gas was settling, leaving the air heavy and swimming with the scent of a public pool gone wrong. It had bought them minutes, but not salvation. The heavy thud of boots on the floorboards told Monique the team had regrouped, likely with masks this time. They were trapped in the bedroom, the only exit blocked by men paid to leave no witnesses. Kwon checked the magazine of his gun. "2 rounds," he whispered, his face slick with sweat. He tried to stand and failed, sliding back down the doorframe. "I can take the first one. The second one will kill us." Monique looked at the twins, huddled under the bed, silent with terror. She looked at Kwon, a king bleeding out on her carpet. Then she looked at her phone. "Give me the gun." No, he wouldn't. "Stay here," she commanded. "Monique, no." Kwon reached for her, but she was already moving. She smoothed her uniform, held her phone high in her right hand like a talisman, and unlocked the bedroom door. She stepped into the hallway, right into the path of 3 tactical lights. "Drop it," a voice boomed. 3 red laser dots converged on her chest, dancing over her name tag. Monique didn't flinch. She didn't raise her hands. She kept her thumb hovering millimeters above the screen of her phone. "Go ahead," she said, her voice shaking but loud enough to fill the sudden silence. "Shoot the maid." The lead assassin hesitated. He was huge, masked, a faceless instrument of death. "Clear the line of fire," he ordered his men, stepping forward. "I wouldn't," Monique warned. She turned the phone screen toward them. It showed a cloud storage app, a file selected, and her thumb hovering over a button that read "Process Upload." "My shift manager isn't the only one I send reports to. I have a dead man's switch linked to this account. If my thumb leaves this screen, if I drop this phone, if I die, the entire server dump your boss is looking for goes to the FBI, the Chicago Tribune, and the IRS." It was a lie. The file was a PDF of her overdue electric bill. But in the dim light, with the adrenaline pumping, it looked like a death sentence for their employer. The lead assassin froze. He knew Kwon had the data. It was plausible the maid had it too. The calculation played out behind his mask. Kill the target, lose the war. "You're bluffing," he growled, but he lowered his rifle an inch. "Am I?" Monique stepped closer, the lasers burning her eyes. "I clean up after rich men for a living. I know where all the bodies are buried. Do you want to bet your paycheck on it?" For a heartbeat, the hallway was frozen. The assassin's focus was entirely locked on Monique's thumb. That was the split second Kwon needed. The bedroom door flew open. Kwon didn't stand. He slid out on the floor, shooting upward. The boom of the hand cannon was deafening in the small space. The lead assassin's head snapped back, his visor shattering. He crumpled before he could pull his trigger. Monique dropped to the floor as chaos erupted, the bluff over, the real war beginning. The hallway was no longer a kill box. It was a hive of silent, terrifying efficiency. Kwon's loyalists, the Wolf Guard who had finally broken through the blockade, moved with the precision of surgeons. They didn't just remove the bodies of the assassins, they scrubbed the memory of them from the floorboards. Monique sat on her ruined sofa, a blanket draped over her shoulders. The adrenaline had crashed, leaving her hollow and trembling. Across the room, Kwon was being attended to by a field medic. He was no longer the desperate man bleeding on her linoleum. He was Kwon Ti-young again. The bloody shirt was gone, replaced by a fresh coat one of his men had provided. The posture was rigid, the aura of command restored like a crown placed back on a king's head. He stood up, wincing only slightly as he adjusted his cuffs. He walked over to her, extending a thick, heavy envelope. "There is $50,000 in here," Kwon said, his voice devoid of the intimacy they had shared in the dark. "And a ticket to Vancouver. My men will escort you to the airport. You disappear, you live." It was a dismissal, a transaction completed. The maid had saved the boss, and the boss was tipping her. Monique looked at the envelope. It was more money than she would make in 5 years. It was freedom from the debt, from the invisible grind. She reached for it, her hand shaking. "Time to go, boys," a large man in a dark suit said, stepping forward to collect the heirs. The reaction was instant. Jaden screamed, a high, panicked sound that cut through the room. Jordan lunged, not away from the stranger, but toward Monique. He buried his face in her lap, his small fists gripping the fabric of her uniform like it was the only solid thing in the world. Jaden followed, scrambling up beside her, kicking wildly at the suit who tried to approach. "No," Jaden sobbed, clinging to her arm. "No go, Auntie Mo." The room went silent. The Wolf Guard froze, uncertain, looking to Kwon for orders. They could handle assassins, but they didn't know how to handle a toddler's grief. Monique froze, her hand hovering over the money. She looked down at the 2 boys who had been orphans, then targets, and now hers. She felt the warmth of them against her legs, the absolute, terrified trust they placed in her. She realized she couldn't unclasp their hands even if she wanted to. Kwon watched them. He looked at his empire, the armed men, the money, the cold efficiency. And then he looked at the woman who had turned a bottle of bleach into a weapon and a drafty apartment into a fortress. He realized that $50,000 could buy a bodyguard, but it couldn't buy this. It couldn't buy the way his sons looked at her. He reached out, but not to give her the money. He took the envelope from her hand and slid it back into his pocket. "Change of plans," Kwon said, his dark eyes locking onto hers, intense and unyielding. "You aren't going to Vancouver." "I'm not," Monique whispered, her hand instinctively smoothing Jordan's hair. "No," Kwon said, signaling his men to stand down. "My sons have a father, but it seems they have chosen a mother, and I cannot rule a kingdom if my house is empty." The sunlight hitting the marble terrace of the hilltop estate felt different than the sun in the city below. It was cleaner, unfiltered by smog and desperation. Monique stood at the edge of the balcony, the wind catching the hem of her emerald silk dress, rippling the fabric like water. 6 months ago, she would have been the one on her knees polishing the glass doors behind her, invisible to the people living inside. Today, she was the one looking out. Down on the manicured lawn, Jaden and Jordan were chasing a golden retriever puppy, their shrieks of laughter echoing against the high stone walls. They were no longer the silent, terrified bundles she had pulled from the wreckage. They were loud, joyous, and utterly safe. They had grown into the confidence that came with knowing nothing could touch them. She didn't hear Kwon approach. He still moved like a shadow when he wanted to, but she felt the shift in the air, a familiar gravitational pull. His hand settled on the small of her back, warm and heavy through the silk. It wasn't the desperate, bloody grip of a dying man anymore. It was the possessive claim of a king. "The council is arriving," Kwon said, his voice low, vibrating against her shoulder. "They are nervous." "Good," Monique replied, not looking away from the boys. "Nervous men make fewer mistakes." Kwon made a sound that was half laugh, half hum. He stepped closer, wrapping his other arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his tailored suit. "You terrified the underboss from Incheon last week. He told me your eyes are colder than mine." Monique turned in his embrace, looking up at him. Her face was no longer gaunt with exhaustion. Her skin glowed, her hair was styled to perfection, but the steel in her gaze remained. It was the same look she had worn in the hallway of the projects, holding a phone like a detonator. "I just told him the truth," she said softly, reaching up to straighten his tie. "I told him that I cleaned up your blood once and I have no intention of doing it again, so if he steps out of line, I won't call you. I'll handle the mess myself." Kwon stared at her, a fierce mixture of adoration and respect in his dark eyes. He had offered her money to leave, thinking he was saving her. He hadn't realized he was recruiting the only partner capable of standing beside him. "My iron mother," he whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Ready?" she asked. "Always." Monique took his arm. She cast one last look at the garden, checking the perimeter guards she had personally vetted, ensuring the safety of her sons. Then, with her head held high, the former maid turned to walk back into the house, ready to rule.